To summarize Deuteronomy into one sentence, we could say it is the principle to accompanying the Lord. It was the rules of accompanying the Lord, whereas Leviticus is the eligibility to accompany the Lord, and Numbers was the method to accompany the Lord. The Lord had given to the Israelites the instructions on how to be holy in Leviticus and how to live with the Lord in Numbers. Moses gave the Israelites the instructions on how to live in the promised land. Let's learn the method and try to put it into practice in our daily lives. Frame of the Old Testament. Follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, key words, national perspective, and authorities perspective to the genealogy of Jesus, the book's allocation and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly, BC and Adam's Chronicle. The time background of Deuteronomy was in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. The Lord's command. There are different approaches to interpreting Moses' speeches. Most of the scholars agree that there were 3 speeches. But there are different opinions in the time point of view. One opinion is that Moses did all the speeches in one day. The other one is that he did them in a week or several days. To be frank, none of them is proved. From a spiritual point of view, there are 2 major interpretations. One is just to simply divide them into the first, second, third, and appendix. The other is to divide them into the past, the present, and the future. But in this class, we will take a little different approach. We have 34 chapters which is divided into 7 parts. The first part was to recall their journey from Horeb to the plain of Moab and review causes to the failure in obeying the Lord. And it was followed by Shema in Hebrew, which means hear. Then the way to obey laws, loving the Lord and loving neighbor followed. And the last 2 parts were urging people's resolution and Moses' will. These 7 parts were categorized into 3 groups: intro of speech, subject of the speech, and urging the Israelites to resolute whether they would obey the Lord or not. Number 1, recall. What was the recall of the first part? Moses reminded the Israelites of the cause of failing the first attempt to conquer the promised land. They disobeyed the Lord's command to go up there and possess it by defeatist report after exploring the land. He didn't mention anything in the desert for 38 years and just said that they made their way around the hill country of Seir for a long time, as seen in chapter 2 verse 1, like in the book of Numbers. Moses didn't refer to the matter in the hill country of Seir through Torah. Therefore, he continued to talk about their journey back to Kadesh from the hill country of Seir, as stated in chapter 2, verse 3. You have made your way around this hill country long enough, now turn north. Chapter 2 and 3 stated that the journey from Kadesh to the plain of Moab. A significance was that the Lord didn't allow the Israelites to harass the Moabites and the Ammonites because the Lord had given them their land as their possession, as stated in chapter 2, verse 19. The Israelites defeated the Amorites and Bashan, as stated from chapter 2, verse 26 to chapter 3, verse 11. And allotted the east land to Jordan River to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of Manasseh. Chapter 3 ended with the matter with Moses, who was forbidden to cross the Jordan, as seen in verse 27, and just showed him the land at the top of Pisgah. Number 2, Shema. Moses began to expound the laws after the recollection of their journey from Horeb to Moab in chapter 4. The chapter began with Hear now, O Israel. Here is Shema in Hebrew, which was repeated several times in Deuteronomy. Therefore, this Shema Israel symbolically represent Deuteronomy. This chapter didn't talk about detailed items, but the general rule to obey the laws and punishment for disobedience. Moses emphasized in verse 2 not to add to what he commanded and not to subtract from it. The chapter ended with the story about the cities of refuge. These two parts were intro of the speech. Number 3, way to obey laws. Chapter 5 began to summon all of Israel, which implied that this was the second speech. Here Moses emphasized the Israelites to learn what he declared on that day as seen in verse 1. It was followed by the 10 Commandments and ended with an instruction on how to live as stated in chapter 5 verse 33. Walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. Chapter 6 began with an instruction to love the Lord, as stated in chapter 6, verse 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This passage was emphasized again by Jesus as a new command in Mark chapter 12, verse 13, with an addition of mind, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Chapter 6 ended with an instruction on how to teach children about the laws. As stated in verse 24, the Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. Chapter 7 began with the code of conduct, what they have to do for nations in the promised land. As stated in verse 2, it was demanded to destroy them totally. A significance was the reason why the Lord had chosen the Israelites, as seen in verse 7. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It was followed by an encouragement for them to conquer the land, as stated in verse 21. Do not be terrified by them, for the Lord your God, who is among you, is a great and awesome God. This can be applied to me today when I face big troubles or enemies in my life. Chapter 8 began with the reason why the Lord put the people in the desert for 40 years, as stated in verse 2. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years, to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. The Lord wanted to humble the Israelites and test them in order to know what was in their heart. From a spiritual point of view today, the Lord also wants me to be humble and keep his commands. When I am not humble or do not keep his commands, my life will be in the desert. Verse 8 is important to know the plants available in the land at the time. A land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. A significance in this chapter was that Moses explained why the Lord had given manna to them in verse 16. He gave you manna to eat in desert, something your fathers had never known, to humble and to test you so that in the end it might go well with you. Number 4, loving the Lord. Moses expounded the way the Lord gave the promised land to the Israelites. It was not for their righteousness, but the nation's wickedness, as stated in chapter 9, verse 4. Then Moses reminded them of their disobedience in the desert by the incidents of both the golden calf and the exploration of the land. In the first part of the chapter 10, Moses continued to talk about the second tablets of the 10 Commandments. It was followed by the Lord's request to them, as seen in verse 12, to fear the Lord, walk in all his ways, love him, and serve him. What does it mean serve at the time? It was not probably to preach gospel or do missionary, because he was talking to the Israelites who were the chosen people. Therefore, this was probably to worship the Lord. In the context, we have to love and serve the Lord today as well. How to serve the Lord? Worship. All family members should serve the Lord together at designated time with a priority every day. For this, Moses advised them to circumcise their hearts and not to be stiff-necked any longer, as written in verse 16. Chapter 10 ended with the Lord's identification and his work. In chapter 11, Moses emphasized the Israelites to teach and talk the commands all the time, as stated in verse 19. In verse 18, he commanded to fix the commands in their heart and mind, and to tie them on their hands as a symbol and bind them on their foreheads. In verse 19, write them on the doorframes and gates of their houses. To summarize these into verbs, teach, talk, fix, tie, bind, write. TTFTBW. In verse 26, he said blessing and curse, and in verse 29, he requested them to proclaim the blessings on Mount Gerizim and the curses on Mount Ebal when they would enter the land. Moses began chapter 12 with emphasizing the demolition of idols and their altars in the land. Then he referred to the place to offer in verse 5, seek the place the Lord will choose and put his name there. He requested the people to rejoice before the Lord altogether when they offered, as seen in verse 12. In verse 21, he commanded them to slaughter animals from their herds and flocks and eat it if the place where the Lord chose was too far. The chapter ended with a command not to add to all he commanded or take away from it, as seen in verse 32. Chapter 13 began with a warning against idolatry. A significant spiritual message from chapter 13 is that the Lord is testing us to find out whether we love him with all our heart and soul, as stated in verse 3, through idols. What are idols around you today? Money, power, reputation, children, friend, online games, etc. Remember that the Lord is testing you whether you love him with all your heart and soul or not. Number 5. A loving neighbor. Chapter 14 began with a declaration to verify that the Israelites were the children of the Lord, as stated in verse 1. And Moses commanded them not to shave the dead. It was followed by the foods to eat or not to eat and tithe. He expounded on how to share it with people in joy. Chapter 15 stated 3 topics: canceling a debt in the 7th year, freeing servants in the 7th year, and offering the firstborn male from the herds and flocks. In chapter 16, Moses gave instructions on how to serve the Lord's feast, but he only explained the 3 feasts: the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Here take notice that his explanation on these festivals were different from the other books. He emphasized being joyful with the people. Moses commanded the people to appoint judges and officials for each of the tribes in every town, as stated in verse 18. This chapter ended with a command not to set up any wooden Asherah pole besides the altar and not to erect a sacred stone, as seen in verse 21 and 22. These chapters from 14 to 16 were for the children of the Lord. The next chapters from 17 to 19 were for the priests. Chapter 17 began with instructions for the priests on offering, judging the idolatry and disputes between people. It was followed by the 4 duties of the king. A significance was that he prophesied that the Israelites would want a king, as stated in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us. It was fulfilled at the end of the judges' ages, and Saul became their first king. He gave a condition to set a king in verse 15, that they should appoint a king the Lord chose among their own brothers. As stated in verses 16 to 20, there were 4 duties of the king. The first one was not to acquire great numbers of horses for himself. Why was this forbidden to the king? It was because horses were for war, which belonged to the Lord. It was considered as humanism, but this was later broken by Solomon. The second one was not to take many wives, but this was also broken by David and Solomon. The third one was not to accumulate large amounts of silver and gold, but this too was not observed by the Israelite kings. The fourth one was to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law before the priest, and read it for all the days of his life. Here notice that Moses commanded that the king should write the laws for himself. It was not just reading it, he should write it. Why did the king have to write it? Because he should learn the law carefully, remember it and follow it. But unfortunately, no one did this throughout their kingdom's history. Chapter 18 began with the priest and the Levite portions and inheritance. As stated in verse 2, they had no inheritance among their brothers because the Lord was their inheritance. It was followed by a warning to them not to imitate their detestable way of the nations after entering the land as seen in verse 9. A significance was the Lord's promise to raise a prophet like Moses from among their own brothers as stated in verse 15. Chapter 19 began with the cities of refuge. Verse 2 described the 3 cities centrally located in the land. How many cities of refuge were designated at the time? Yes, there were 6 cities. Why did this passage refer to only 3 cities? Because these 3 cities were the only ones in the promised land that were to the west of the Jordan River. The other 3 cities were located to the east of the Jordan River. Where were the 6 cities? Kadesh was in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Hebron in the hill country of Judah. These 3 cities were in the hill country on the west side of Jordan. Bezer in the desert on the plateau in the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan, the tribe of Manasseh. These 3 cities were in the desert on the east side of Jordan. Please open the book of Joshua, chapter 20, verse 7 to 8, and check this. All cities were in 6 tribes, Judah, Ephraim, Naphtali, Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad. How did the Lord select these 6 tribes? We can't know for sure, but we can guess that it was based on Jacob's wives. Leah's descendants were from Judea and Reuben. Rachel's descendants were from Ephraim and Manasseh. Zilpah's descendant was from Gad, and Bilhah's descendant was from Naphtali. The city of refuge was a device in a loving people. Chapter 20 talked about going to war. It began with their attitude saying, "Do not be afraid of your enemy, because the Lord will be with you," as stated in verse 1. Then the 4 exemption cases to serve for the war were followed in verses 5 to 8. The first case was anyone not to dedicate a new house after building it. The second case was anyone not to enjoy it after planting a vineyard. The third case was anyone not to marry after engagement. The last case was anyone who was afraid or faint-hearted. All these cases were based on the loving people apart from achieving the task. In connection to this, they were advised to make its people an offer of peace before attacking the enemy as stated in verse 10. There were many items in chapters 21 to 25, but most of them were based on loving and caring for people. Chapter 26 described the offerings of first fruits and tithes. Here a different point from the other books about them was that all people rejoiced together with the offerings as stated in verse 11, and all people ate together as seen in verse 12. This section ended by proclaiming the Israelites his treasured possession as seen in verse 18. And the Lord had declared that he would set them in praise, fame, and honor high above all the nations, and that they will be people holy to the Lord, as written in verse 19. In conclusion of his speech, we must realize that the Lord is our God and walk in his ways, keep the laws and obey him, be proud that we are his treasure, and never forget that we are people holy to the Lord. This was not just for the people from several thousand years ago. This is for us today as well, and for the people to come until Jesus' second coming. Deuteronomy is not stuffy or old-fashioned. Number 6, resolution. In chapter 27, Moses and the elders commanded the people to write all laws they heard from Moses on stones and set them up on Mount Ebal. Then build the altar of the Lord your God with the filled stones and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord, as stated in verse 6. It was followed by the curses from Mount Ebal. Moses commanded the Israelites to divide into 2 parts. Each of the 6 tribes stood on Mount Gerizim for blessing and on Mount Ebal for curses. But the following verses toward the end of the chapter were only for curses. Chapter 28 is famous for being a blessing chapter, but most of the parts are about curses, from verse 15 to 68. The condition for blessing was very simple, as stated in chapter 28, verse 2. All these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. Since this is the truth, we must follow this. Chapter 29 talked about the covenant in Moab to confirm them as his people, as stated in verse 13. Let's see this in detail in the slide on the spiritual frame. Chapter 30 surprisingly stated that the Lord would gather them again from all nations where he scattered them. Moses reconfirmed the blessings and curses as seen in verse 15. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. Number 7, Moses' will. In chapter 31, Moses encouraged them to be strong and courageous, not to be afraid, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you, as written in verse 6. He commanded them to read the law at the end of every 7 years during the Feast of Tabernacles in verses 10 and 11. It was followed by the laws prophesied that the people will disobey, and commanded them to write this song and teach it to the Israelites, as stated in verse 16 and 19. Chapter 32 was Moses' song, which described the Lord and his reactions to the people's deeds. Chapter 33 was for Moses' blessing to the tribes except Simeon. Why did Moses miss it? Because Simeon would be scattered by Jacob's curse, as stated in Genesis chapter 49, verse 7. Chapter 34 was for Moses' death, but he was not weak, even though he was 120 years old. Moses laid hands on to Joshua, as seen in verse 9. As stated in verse 10, since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This last part was to urge the Israelites to make a resolution to obey the Lord. In conclusion, the first part emphasized the people to learn and follow the law without addition to it and subtraction from it. The third part urged the people to make resolutions. Let's see in detail some subject next class. Thanks for watching.